I should have known it was a dodgy link. No excuses. It wasn't as obvious as those messages you get advertising free followers, but it wasn't far off. I can't remember the name of the Twitter handle it came from anymore. When I checked earlier this morning on my phone, my head still pounding from a night of half-price cocktails, the whole message thread had vanished. All I have is a hazy memory of the profile picture. It was a little icon showing Earth, like you might get for a travel company, and the text that came with the link. Congratulations, you've been selected for a once-in-a-lifetime adventure. I read that DM about 3 in the morning, slumped in front of my iMac after a heavy night of work drinks. Late night social media binges isn't a new thing for me, but work drinks most certainly are. I started a new job at a media company last month after being unemployed for 3 months. This was our first social. I must have been a little nervous because I ended up drinking way too much. I guess it was the booze that made me click the link. My memory of that 3 AM session is pretty blurry, but I know what happened next. Nothing. At least, not at first. I clicked the link, my cursor did that spinning beach ball thingy for a moment, and then that was it. I was feeling mildly disappointed when my email pinged. Sender, far away destinations. Subject line, preparing for launch. Sam, you have friends in high places. You have been specially selected to go on a once-in-a-lifetime trip, and the adventure starts now. The seed has been planted, and in just a few short hours, the countdown begins. For the time being, all you need to do is get a bag packed and await further instructions. Cancellations. If you do not wish to claim your prize, click here. Please note, refunds cannot be made after the countdown timer begins. Doors will close 2 hours prior to departure. Just before I fell into a drunken sleep, I remember wondering what countdown timer meant. I woke up this morning about 9 o'clock. You know that horrible post-drunk feeling where you want to sleep more, but your headache keeps waking you up? My brain felt like it had swollen in my skull. My mouth was dry and sticky. I needed to pee, but even the thought of rolling over and trying to get out of bed made me feel sick. After another half hour of trying and failing to go back to sleep, I finally admitted defeat. I sat up slowly, and as I was reaching for the pint of water next to my bed, the computer caught my eye. I frowned. For the briefest moment, as I tried to work out what I was seeing on the screen, even the pain in my head faded. My first thought was, did I leave my computer on last night? My second, I must have changed my screensaver by accident. The screen of my iMac was black, all over, except for the center. Right in the middle was a sequence of large, blocky numbers in green font. At the time, they read 8:46 hours. As I stared at the screen, there was a soft beeping sound, and the end digit switched to a 5. 8:45 hours. I got up and tiptoed over to my computer, keeping in a half crouch to try and ward off the worst of the pain in my head. I already thought I knew what must have happened. For whatever reason, in my drunken state, I'd added some weird screensaver to my iMac. Possibly one that acted as an alarm or something. When I reached out to move the mouse and clear the screen though, nothing happened. The numbers stayed in place. I was moving my hand over to the keyboard to give that a go, when I saw it. Damn. covering about a third of the keys, was this sticky, half-dried purple substance. It wasn't just over the keys either. I hadn't noticed it at first because I'd been distracted by the numbers on the screen, but the stuff was on the left-hand side of my desk as well, not to mention spreading across the carpet below. Damn it. I couldn't remember spilling a drink, but I figured I must have knocked over a glass of Ribena or something. I was tiptoeing away to start the long, painful journey downstairs for a cloth when I suddenly remembered the Twitter DM. That dodgy link that made my cursor spin. I shut my eyes. This wasn't good at all. At some point, between getting in last night and falling asleep, I'd managed to royally screw up my computer. First, I managed to spill liquid all over it without even noticing, and then I clicked something that was most probably a virus. Idiot. As I reached the door of my room, my head still pounding, I heard a soft bleep behind me. I turned back. 8:44 hours. The email on my phone pinged as I was eating breakfast. White bread, fried bacon, brown sauce. At some point during the long trip downstairs, I'd made the executive decision that sorting out my computer could wait. I felt terrible, and scrubbing sticky stuff off my keyboard and calling up the Apple Store were pretty much the last things I wanted to do. I fumbled my phone out of my pocket and thumbed the message icon. Sender. Far away destinations. Subject line. The clock is ticking. Sam. Final preparations are being made for your trip. We hope your bags are packed. The seed is spreading, and it's only 8 hours to departure. Please remember that doors will close 2 hours prior to takeoff, so now is the perfect time to purchase any final supplies and visit with loved ones to let them know your travel plans. We hope you're as excited as we are. Cancellations. Refunds are no longer available. Doors will close in 6 hours. The first feeling I had while reading that email was confusion. The second was mild relief. It was a joke. That was all. The whole thing had to be. I suddenly remembered the email I'd received the night before, shortly before falling asleep, and how ridiculous that had been. The link I clicked in the Twitter DM had obviously installed something on my computer. The countdown timer was evidence enough of that, but my guess was that it was probably the only thing it had installed. Just some elaborate social media prank, or a PR stunt. A jokey countdown to go along with the dumb, jokey emails. It wasn't ransomware. At least, that much seemed clear. My guess was that once the countdown reached 0, there'd be some final joke or some big effort to sell me something, and that would be it. I'd still get the computer checked out, of course, and I'd still have to clean up that spilled drink. But maybe my files and photos weren't at risk. I finished my sandwich and washed it down with an Alka-Seltzer, stuck the sauce-smeared plate in the sink. Then I made what I now realize might have been the biggest mistake of my life. I went and sat down on the sofa, slumped down on it actually. My headache was fading slightly, and I was starting to feel tired again. I put the TV on, found some mindless comedy. As canned laughter drifted from the TV screen, I fell asleep. I woke with a start. I'd been having a nightmare, something about being trapped in a building I didn't recognize, unable to find my way out. The headache was gone, but my nausea was still there. Only now, it felt less like a hangover sickness and more like a kind of anxious churning, low down in my belly. like the butterflies you get before something big is about to happen. That feeling is still in my stomach now, as I record this. It's worse now though, much worse. And I don't know how much time I have left, so I'll have to keep this short. After sitting up on the sofa and turning the TV off, the first thing I did was wander over to my back door. I have a tiny little garden, and all I wanted at that moment was to feel some fresh air on my face. Help me feel more alive. The door is on the far side of the kitchen, and I knew something was wrong before I'd even reached it. Have you ever had that feeling where you see something out of focus, something on the edge of your vision, and it takes a couple of seconds to realize what it is? Maybe a dark spot on the bathroom ceiling that turns out to be a spider, or a shadow standing still in an alley that suddenly takes the shape of a man. It's a hard one to describe, but that feeling, that sudden gut punch of dread, was exactly what I experienced as I walked towards my back door. It was covered in purple goo. Not like a stain or a spillage, but a whole web of the stuff. It was thickest around the door's edges and the handle, but it was everywhere, running in skinny strands down the wood, covering the small, frosted glass window in a light film. All over. It took me several seconds of staring before I realized it was the same stuff I'd seen on my computer upstairs. That sticky-looking, half-dried purple. The worst of it, the stuff around the edges of the door, had hardened, making a dark ridge that looked almost solid. I traced the gunk with my eyes. It had run down onto the door from the ceiling above, which it crisscrossed in sticky trails. Like the slime patterns left by slugs, I remember thinking. These trails covered the entire length of the kitchen ceiling, leading out the doorway and into the hallway beyond. Feeling like a sleepwalker, no longer in control of my own body, I followed them. That walk, from my kitchen, through my hallway, and up the stairs to my bedroom, felt surreal. It was like something out of a dream. The purple stuff had spread through my entire house. It ran in thick streaks across the ceiling. Puddles of it stained the carpet. It wrapped itself around my banister like some gooey, exotic vine. As I walked through the hallway and followed it up the stairs, I glanced once at my front door. I already knew what I'd seen when I did, and I wasn't surprised. The door had pretty much vanished. A thick, purple web had descended over it from the ceiling, covering my only other exit route like a curtain. By the time I was halfway up the stairs, I had to watch where I was putting my feet. The purple goo was thicker up here. It hung down in strands from the ceiling and spread in patches across the carpet. Climbing to the upstairs of my house, and then making my way across the corridor to my bedroom, felt like it took a very long time. Despite what I had already seen, none of it prepared me for what was waiting in my room. I'd left the door open when I came downstairs earlier, and the threshold was as far as I was prepared to go now. Beyond that, everything was purple. Strands hung down from the doorway like vines. The goo darkened every inch of the walls, ceiling, and floor beyond. My bed had disappeared beneath a seemingly solid mass of the stuff. Towards the far end of the room, where my desk rested against the wall, the goo took on a different quality. It was darker, like the stuff that had hardened around the doors downstairs. It sparkled. Looking at it reminded me of the broken geodes we'd studied in biology as kids, the ones that opened up to reveal shining, crystal interiors. Standing in that doorway, staring through those hanging, purple vines, it no longer felt like I was looking into a bedroom. It was like I was looking into a cave. The only thing in my room that I recognized, the one part that remained unchanged, was the screen of my iMac. It started out from that glittering purple mass, like an eye. As I watched, it gave out a soft bleep, and the numbers changed. 1:56 hours. I'm recording this downstairs on my laptop, sitting on a sofa. At some point in the last half hour, almost without realizing, I was forced to lift my feet up to keep them away from the carpet, to avoid touching the purple goo, which has been slowly spreading across the room as we speak. After making the discovery in my bedroom, I have to admit, I panicked. A lot. I ran through my whole house, avoiding the goo while I checked every single window that I could, looking for an escape route. It didn't work, of course. The windows, just like the doors, have all been sealed shut. Next, I tried to call for help. My mum, the police, friends, anyone who might pick up. It didn't make any difference. No matter which number I tried, I got an automated recording telling me the call couldn't connect. Then I tried texting, then DMing people on Facebook. But none of that worked either. Despite the fact I'm connected to the internet, none of my messages go through. I did get one text through my phone though, shortly after I attempted the first few calls. "Uh-oh, you were detected trying to make a phone call. The time to communicate with loved ones has now elapsed. Wi-Fi is available until the point of takeoff, but messages, phone calls, and other forms of direct communications have been disabled to ensure a smooth departure. Best wishes, the Faraway Destinations team." That was when I decided to record this. I figured if I can at least post this online somewhere, rather than telling someone directly, then maybe that will be enough. Enough for the word to get back to my family of what's happened to me. I think that's the best I can hope for now. I don't think they're ever going to find me. Because, here's the thing. 5 minutes ago, I received another one of those weird emails. And I think I finally understand what might be happening to me. I think I know where I'm going after the timer reaches 0. I won't read out the final email because it didn't contain much text. It was the same sender, and all the subject line said was, "We hope you enjoy your trip." The email itself didn't contain any text at all. Just a map. The map was zoomed in on my street, and a small dot, presumably me, was blinking on the place where my house is. A dotted line led away from my house, off the edge of the map. When I hovered my cursor over it though, I was able to use the scroll wheel to zoom out, to make the objects on the map smaller and smaller. Soon I could see my entire town in miniature, and then as I kept scrolling, the whole of the UK. The dotted line ran in a northeast direction, still off the edge of the screen. And I kept zooming out, and the line just kept going, and going, and going. Eventually, I zoomed out so much, I could see the entire Earth in the map's center, a small globe in the middle of a vast, black ocean. And then, I just kept scrolling. After zoning out for another 30 seconds, the Earth was nothing but a tiny white dot in the middle of the screen. After a minute and a half, the entire galaxy filled it, a swirling blue and white helix with an orange center. After another minute or so of zooming, I gave up, because I just couldn't handle it anymore. I couldn't handle the sight of that thin, dotted line stretching on and on into all that black space, seemingly without end. The purple goo is creeping up the sides of the sofa now. The stuff on the ceiling, walls and carpet has hardened too, like the stuff I saw around my computer. The surface of it flashes and twinkles like thousands of stars. I have to post this now. I don't know how much time is left on the countdown, but it can't be helped. Very faintly, like a far-off vibration, I can feel the house beginning to shake. Our sister's suicide affected not only our family, but the entire community in which we lived. She was beloved by nearly everyone. Wherever she went, she left an impression of kindness and comfort. Our town mourned, communally, over the death of Elise. She had a personal philosophy she followed, which essentially stated that life was amazing, an incredible phenomenon made even more wonderful by its ability to self-replicate and alter its own environment to facilitate further reproduction. She was forever awestruck by something we, as a species, consider so commonplace: our own existence. My younger brother was somewhat the opposite. In fact, they'd argue fairly often, her humanitarian views clashing against his sometimes outright misanthropic beliefs. They'd wage a moral and ethical wars in the living room of our home, flinging insults and spewing rhetoric, never convincing each other. It was entertaining for a while. Then, last week, things turned sour, and their last debate ended abruptly. Before, they had been heated and energetic, both siblings orated dramatically, gesturing as if speaking before a greater audience, when I was the only one watching. They still retained a fundamental respect for each other, and despite the shouted insults and profane gestures, they never spoke over each other or became physically confrontational. Last week's debate started the same as they always had. My brother burst into the room to relate some new observation that he thought proved without a doubt that humanity as a whole was inherently and irreparably flawed, unremarkable in the scope of the cosmos, and deserving of no greater consideration than that of any other material object in the universe. His observations and the basis of that particular argument was compelling, I'll give him that. He said that he had witnessed a man leer at a woman while waiting in a line at the grocery store. The man had been with his family, a wife and 2 children. The woman was alone, obviously dressed for a night out. The man's gaze settled on the woman's body long enough for his child, a boy of about 10, to notice, and presumably old enough to understand what his father's stare suggested. The boy had poked his dad, playfully admonishing him against staring, and the father swiftly struck the boy in the face. No one had noticed. My brother said the strike alone was enough to condemn the man, but what unsettled him more was that the boy reacted almost robotically, as if the behavior was something to which he had been accustomed. He turned his head away from his father and stared on, eyes peering emotionless into his mother's back, who hadn't seen anything. The sister, who had seen all that occurred, simply ignored it as if she too were accustomed to her father's violence. Elise had listened quietly, preparing her rebuttal internally and giving Sean a chance to provide his supplemental argument and any personal additions he felt necessary. When he had finally finished, she stood, with a reserved grace that I'd only seen her exhibit during formal occasions, and said, "No, people are merely forms of life, not the essence of it. One man does not represent the concept of life, and his actions were not born of some maliciousness inherent to life. Life is still good by virtue of what it is, and what it isn't." Elise, though certainly an intelligent girl, especially for a 17-year-old, had never spoken so philosophically, or specifically separated the concept of life from its human representation. Before, she always spoke of people and life synonymously, ascribing intrinsic goodness to both. After her intended refutation, she left the room, leaving my brother and I equally dumbfounded. Elise was never one to simply leave an argument so soon, especially after providing such a relatively short-winded counter. I said that she was perhaps tired. She ran track after school, and their arguments usually took place after she arrived home, and to leave her alone for the night. Sean, visibly disappointed by the lack of a real fight, yet understanding of how unusual such behaviour was for our sister, left to go spend time with his friends. After he left, I visited my sister in her room, where I found her sitting on a bed, staring out her window. There had been fast winds that day, and the lone tree in our front yard swayed slightly, while its leaves rattled as if it was shivering. Elise had changed from her track attire to a white t-shirt and grey sweatpants, and had undone a ponytail, letting her dirty blonde hair fall carelessly around her shoulders. "I know how to make him see." She had spoken so softly, I asked her to repeat her words, and when she did, louder, there was an acutely grave suggestion to her tone. "I know how to make him see. I figured it out, Isaac. How to prove once and for all that life, in its true nature, is good, is holy." We weren't a religious family. Our parents had never taken us to church, and we hadn't felt any compulsion to seek spiritual education. I wouldn't say we're a family of science, but we definitely prefer a more straightforward, empirical approach to what is and isn't present within our universe. So her words were shocking, to say the least. "What do you mean, holy?" I tried to speak calmly, because something about her expression, which had changed from distant, almost forlorn, to a little excited, had unnerved me. Her eyes were wide, her forehead creased, and her body stiff, as if in anticipation of something of which only she had been aware. Perhaps sacred is a better word. I don't mean to suggest any mundane religious connotations. I'm not talking about divinity as applied to your average man-conceived belief system. Life is good, sacred, fascinating, because of its power. Life brings about change of everything. Life is the only force, the only energy that cannot be dissipated, dispersed, or disrupted if the form life takes is persistent enough. Her words were nonsense to me, and her agitation grew until she had sat perched on the edge of her bed, kicking back and forth rapidly. I don't think she was even aware of the physical manifestations of her excitation. "Elise, you're tired. You should get some sleep." She cocked her head at that, as if I'd said something humorously naive. "The will, Isaac. I speak of the will. That spiritual engine which drives us to survive, to propagate as a species, to persist. People believe that emotions like grief, anger, or regret can make a person survive, partially after death, in spectral form. They believe that if something is felt enough, just before death, the feeling can stall the person's annihilation, allowing them to subsist amidst the shadows as ghosts, spirits, wraiths, etc. It's all nonsense. Her voice grew louder, her expression crazed, her physicality manic. Delusions, all of it, but the will, it's different. It is the amalgamation of all those things, combined with something deeper, something baser. Most people have feeble, unremarkable wills. When they die, so too dies their will to reject death, to sustain life. They accept their invitation to oblivion. But those with strong, powerful wills, those revenants who return to life, regardless of the physical, mortal trauma they have suffered, those are the true divines. They are the best representations of life and its beauty. I was speechless. As a 15-year-old with zero experience in such a weighty topic, incapable of participating in any sort of debate or discussion with her. When I did not respond, she nodded her head and smiled, as if I had expressed in some way my agreement with her deranged oration. I will show you how strong my will is, Isaac. I'll show you right now. She removed a knife from under a pillow, one of Dad's expensive kitchen set, and brought the tip to her throat and said, "See you in a bit." Then sank the blade just under her chin. She let out a sort of yelp and then choking sounds as she pressed the blade deeper. She had almost gone to the handle, and all the while staring at me, placidly, when she said her last words. "I will be remade." She then died, with both hands grasping the handle of the knife. The blade fully plunged into her throat. A wide red streak had fallen from the wound and down her shirt. A single torrent of crimson that pooled silently on the wooden floor. I stood there, unsure as to what had happened. When I first started to process things, I started screaming. And that's how my brother found me 2 hours later. He said our sister's eyes were still open, even then, fixed in a lunatic's gaze, as if she was still alive, staring into something beyond her perception. We buried her 3 days later. My parents didn't talk to us much while Elise had been alive. They both worked together in some pharmaceutical corporation and rarely had time to do family things. They were attentive enough, but still distant. After Elise's suicide, it was as if they lived somewhere else. I rarely saw them after the first few days following her burial, and when I did, it was only in passing, as if we were acquaintances, offering unenthused gestures of recognition on the street. They behaved furtively, as if they knew something about Elise that I didn't. When I could not extract answers from them, I investigated her room. I won't disgrace her memory by sharing any of the uniquely personal items I found. The only relative discovery was a series of medical documents dated a few weeks earlier, all intended for Elise. They detailed the results of a series of tests performed over the last few weeks, all of which indicated, without question, that Elise had a tumor on her brain. Her symptoms, some of which she had apparently described, others which were detected, listed such things as lightheadedness, blurred vision, hallucinations, and, on one occasion, seizure. I wasn't aware of any of this. I thought I'd understood then. Her pre-suicide ranting had been the combined result of stress, a fear of death, and its permanence, and the warped thoughts of someone whose brain was being corrupted by a malignant tumour. It all made sense under that context. That tore me apart. That her last moments had been expressed through a filter of mild insanity. My sadness was replaced with fear when I began to hear her voice in my head. "Isaac, I told you I'd return. My will has beaten back death. I live." I first heard her while mindlessly watching TV, thinking about nothing. I didn't even need to look around. I knew that her voice had originated within my mind, not from somewhere within the room or somewhere else in the house. She continued to speak with me after that, excitedly, constantly, never letting me have a minute of peace. She wasn't angry or hateful or anything that would have suggested she was vengeful towards her brother, who had failed to save her, who had simply screamed and screamed for hours. But she wasn't kind either. Before, during her arguments with my brother, she would allow him as much time to speak as he wanted. But in my head, she went on and on, stepping over my thoughts, silencing my inner voice for hours while she expounded about her experience, quote, beyond the bounds of mortality. It was dreadful, nightmarish stuff. But she spoke of it almost lovingly. I started getting headaches. The more she spoke, the longer she took control of my cognition. The more she made me think and perceive as she would have. I went to the doctor, and after a series of tests, was told that I had a tumour growing in my brain. I asked Elise about it, and she said that my will was weak, and perhaps she could make better use of my body once I'd vacated it. She spoke softly, kindly, as a nurse would a moribund patient. I told her that maybe the tumour that was in her brain was a part of her, that her will, regardless of the body, was corruptive, that she was inherently bad. She stopped talking after that. But I can still feel her in me. I think she's just waiting for me to die. I don't hate her. I don't think she's evil. But I do think she's wrong about life. Wrong that it's good, just because it has the potential to surmount all adversity, survive all conditions. I won't let her have my body. She didn't want to be consumed by her tumour, wouldn't accept that kind of death. I won't either. I was 7 when it first happened. I never had much in the way of friends. Same with Cash, come to think of it. I was doing what I had always done when I was bored at that age, playing in a field near my parents' small wooden cabin. We were poor, very little to do when your parents didn't make much money. They had to spend it on important stuff like heating and the taxes. Oftentimes, I was glad just to have running water and a bed to sleep in at night. Anyway, the field. It was surrounded by woodland, all of the trees being tall, skinny conifers, mostly spruce with outstretched limbs that clawed at the sky. The field was quite large and was perfect for imitating my favourite scenes from all manner of media and literature. I would pretend to be Darth Vader fighting Luke Skywalker, or Captain Jack Sparrow making a narrow escape, or even Valkyrie Kane wielding magic to save the world once more. My father worked as a low-level convenience employee. My mother, well, she tried to work as a streetwalker, often taking our rusty old Ford pickup truck into the city. She tried, she did, but I knew she hated it. Her and Dad had discussed it, argued for days, and then he finally gave in, as long as she had contraceptive methods at the ready. We couldn't afford another child. Even though she worked, she rarely got customers. She was over 40 years old and a bit too plump for most folks prowling the streets to see as sexy, or at least what sexy is thought of these days. It was any ordinary day. I'd come home from school, my mother having to drive me into the city in order to get there. After school, I took the bus as close as it would take me to the forest where I lived. It was usually an hour-long walk to get home from there. After that walk, I always went to the field, making my way through the coniferous trees and humming my favourite songs. Most of what I entertained myself with during my time in that field came from my imagination. I would occasionally get to watch movies and videos on the school computers during the lunch hour. I always signed out as many books as I was allowed from the school's library. I don't quite remember the story I had made up for myself that time, but that doesn't matter. I was in the field, like always, when he appeared. He came from the woods. Most strange things do. A man of long and thin proportions who pushed between the hundreds of conifer needles and scraggly branches. I was at the opposite end of the field as he was, and I simply watched him walk towards me, taking huge, exaggerated strides with his spider-like legs. He was about halfway across when I finally got the sense that I should run from this man, this creature. I tried to, but my movements were sluggish, and I didn't get 5 paces before he was in front of me. I didn't know what he was at first. Without the man saying a single thing, I knew him as Mr. Longnose, and I knew what he wanted. Mr. Longnose was wearing a simple, dark red trench coat that swished the grass at his feet. He had tall, black combat boots on his feet and a pair of mirrored sunglasses perched upon his nose. And what a nose he had! Even though his disturbingly tall and gangly form, not to mention his arms that draped all the way down to his feet, was downright horrifying, his nose scared me the most. It stretched out from his face like a bird beak, pale white like the rest of his skin, and curved downwards sharply. The appendage seemed as though it should have weighed down his head, especially because his neck was so wiry. He didn't say anything, but I suddenly became aware that Mr. Longnose wanted me to play a game. He didn't speak at all, but I could hear a voice, or some sort of presence that began counting down from 60. It resonated from Mr. Longnose like a pulse. Instructions had appeared in my mind. I had to hide from Mr. Longnose. I started to run. I ran across the field, into the woods, between the trees, towards my house. Soon my throat was raw from the exertion, and I dropped behind a fallen tree to catch my breath. I could hear something walking through the soft pine needles. A few twigs cracked. Mr. Longnose was looking for me. His game was hide and seek, an entertainment I was familiar with. I could feel the air from his movements and sense the swish of his coat. My teeth were chattering, my tongue was cold and dry, I felt antsy and paranoid. I couldn't stay still any longer. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't get far before Mr. Longnose came into my peripheral vision. He was still taking those extensive steps, his head turned towards me. I could see my ramshackle home in the distance, and I could hear my father using his mallet to pound nails and seal the hole in the roof. "Dad! Dad, help me!" I screamed. Mr. Longnose was right behind me now. He was making some sort of clicking noise, like the sound of a metal fork on someone's teeth. My foot caught on a log, and I was sent sprawling into the dirt. When I looked up, Mr. Longnose was looming over me. One of his hands came forward and touched my chest. A pain so intense forced my muscles rigid, and I let loose a cry so loud that my voice was hoarse within seconds. And still, I kept wailing as Mr. Longnose plunged his skinny phalanges deep into my flesh. My vision blurred until it was just a mass of grey and brown. When I woke up, Mr. Longnose was gone, and my father was cradling me in his bulky arms. My father immediately pointed out a tattoo on the left side of my neck. It was shaped like a plague doctor mask from the 1600s. I didn't know what it was when I first saw it, but my dad enlightened me, telling me it was something old doctors wore in medieval times. Of course, we were both perplexed, because I had never gotten a tattoo. I was only 7 after all. I was confused and disoriented from my experience, so my response was bleary and gobsmacked to my father. "No, Dad, that's Mr. Longnose," was what I said. He tried to ask me what I meant, but I'd gone catatonic. I stayed that way for a week after I met Mr. Longnose. I saw Mr. Longnose 3 more times. The second time, after the first incident, he appeared in a cafe when I was in London. I'd been 13 years old at the time, and my parents were better off at that point. I tried to call for help from the other patrons, but they only looked confused. It seemed as though I was the only one who could see Mr. Longnose. I ran from the cafe and into the street. I ran and didn't look behind me. I was faster this time, so I had already put quite some distance between myself and Mr. Longnose. All was looking well, until a car swerved around the corner and crunched against me. I could hear Mr. Longnose getting closer, but my legs wouldn't push me up off the ground. He reached me and touched me with his hand again. I awoke in the hospital. This time, there was a tattoo of an eye on my right palm. The third time, I didn't have a chance. He woke me up while I was sleeping in my apartment, still living in London. I was 21 then. He began to count down, and I only made it down the elevator and out the front door before he caught me. Again, another stab of agony and a new marking on my flesh. Now, I had a black rhombus tattoo on my left cheek. After that third encounter, I received a package in the mail. It was a plain brown shipping box. There was no weight in it. The only pressure on my hand was the box itself. I took it up to my room and opened it. There was nothing inside but a piece of paper. It had 3 symbols on it, left to right. First was the plague doctor mask, identical to the one emblazoned on my neck. Next was the eye, again the exact same as the marking on my palm. Then the rhombus, identical. There was a message beneath the sigils. You have been found 3 times. If there is 2 more, Mr. Longnose will claim you. 5 is all he needs. Hide for 3 more, and Mr. Longnose will be impressed. When Mr. Longnose is impressed, hide and seek is over. There was no signature, just a picture of a crudely drawn face with a hideously long nose that I recognized very well. The 4th total time was different. This time, I was prepared for Mr. Longnose. As soon as I heard his countdown, I hopped in my car and started driving. It had been 5 years since the last time. I had just turned 26. I drove for hours, no place in mind, as long as it was anywhere where Mr. Longnose wasn't. I stopped many times for gas until I ran out of money. I saw Mr. Longnose in the distance, taking his giant, cartoonish steps directly towards me. 3 weeks later, I was still going. I'd drawn money from my bank account to keep buying gas to stay away from Mr. Longnose. Distance doesn't seem to be too much of a trifle for him. I started my fleeing in London, and after 3 weeks, I'd gone across the English Channel and into France, then from France to Switzerland, onto Germany. Another week, I'd gone across Czechia and was in the middle of Slovakia. In 4 weeks, I had travelled all over Europe and was actually considering taking the drive to Greece. But then, all of a sudden, I got an air of snapped tension in my mind, and during a short rest stop at a restaurant, I knew it. Mr. Longnose was gone. For now at least. Since then, I've worked out a way to estimate when Mr. Longnose will come for me. He seems to appear about every 4 to 7 years and will seek me for the first 3 weeks or so. If he makes any physical contact with me, I will lose that game of hide and seek. Mr. Longnose has won 4 games of hide and seek so far, and there have been 6 in total. I won the 5th game of hide and seek. 2 down, 1 to go. I'm quite a bit older now. I think I'm at least close to 60 by this point. All I need to do is win 1 more game, and Mr. Longnose will leave me alone. But Mr. Longnose only needs to win 1 more game to claim me, whatever that means. I'm an old man. My memory is foggy. I've been checked for memory ailments and been diagnosed with at least 1. I'm writing the whole story down for myself in a recent moment of clarity. It's been 6 years since I've seen Mr. Longnose, and even while I write this, I can feel his foreboding presence getting closer. Once I finish this document, I'll print out some copies and put up on my walls, so I don't forget that Mr. Longnose is coming. I don't know if I'll even get that far with the way I can sense Mr. Longnose nearing me. I need to go. All I need to take is my food, my water, my cash, and my car. Guns don't work on Mr. Longnose. Bullets just seem to dissipate before they hit him. Knives, pipes, axes, none of that does anything to him. He's getting closer. I can feel it. Mr. Longnose is ready for our last game. And there's no way in hell I will let him win it. I was the first to notice an extra person had joined our group. I counted 6 of us sitting around the campfire, but I knew we had left home with 5. The 6th person had joined us somewhere along our way, but where and when exactly, I could not be sure. All the glowing faces looked familiar, like I'd known them for all a lifetime. That was why it took us so long to find the man out of place. I had to go through the faces one by one. I went through my history with them, recounting how I met them, how I knew them. I fit each one into my memories like puzzle pieces. First, there was Mark. He was sitting next to Sarah, chatting her up as always. I met Sarah and Mark 6 years ago in the 10th grade. Mark and I played wide receiver together on the school football team. Sarah was a cheerleader, and Mark always had a thing for her. The three of us started hanging out after games, Mark flirting non-stop, and Sarah always hilariously rebuking him after a while. Then there was Ben. We had been best friends since the 1st grade, inseparable ever since we bumped heads playing tag during recess. He had his arm around his longtime girlfriend, Justine. She started at our school when she moved from Chicago in the 7th grade. Ben sat next to her in English, and soon she became a part of our group at the time. She was quiet and shy when she first arrived, but once we got to know her, she opened up. She was one of the coolest and nicest people you could ever get to meet. She had also become close with Sarah in the past few years. And then, there was the 6th face, the piece that did not fit. I stared at him, and his name escaped me. That is, if I had ever had it in my memory banks in the first place. He looked familiar, but I could not place him in my memories. But why, if I recognized him, could I not remember his name? Why did he sit among us, acting as if he belonged? He stared at Mark and Sarah as they chatted. He laughed when they laughed, smiled when they smiled. I couldn't figure it out. The question burned in my head. How had he, a stranger, joined our little group without any of us noticing something amiss? "Yo, Porter," Ben pulled me from my thoughts. "Your head up in the clouds or something? I was just telling Justine about our 5th grade teacher. What was his name again?" "Mr. Smith," I said. "Oh yeah, Mr. Smith. I was telling Justine how you could rile up that guy like nobody else. Remember that time you handed in an assignment printed in yellow ink?" Ben and Justine laughed. "Yeah, I remember." I can still see the steam coming out of his ears. They laughed again, and I joined in half-heartedly. When I glanced the strange man's way, he was watching us, grinning. He was always watching, always on the periphery, never partaking. Part of the reason he had flown under the radar. I was struck with a sense that he was studying us. My skin crawled. Ben drained his beer and threw the empty can in the cooler. "Well, I gotta take a leak," he said, and walked into the woods, swallowed up by the dark. "You really know how to push people's buttons when you want to, huh?" Justine said. I shrugged. I was having trouble focusing on the conversation. The weight of the situation, the reality of it, was starting to hit me. A strange man had attached himself to our group unnoticed, and who the hell knew what his motivations were? Questions raced through my mind, none I could answer. How had no one else noticed yet? Why had it taken me so long to notice? Was I going insane? Did I have amnesia and forget this one friend of ours? What in the hell was going on here? The strange man stood with jerkiness. "I gotta take a leak," he said. It was the first time I heard him talk. He spoke with an odd lisp. It sounded as if he had to force the words from his throat. He walked with an awkward gait, and like Ben, disappeared behind the dark veil of the trees. No one else flinched. Justine kept talking. I always loved the long relationship you and Ben have. It was so hard moving cities and leaving all my old friends behind. I mean, I can't complain too much. I wouldn't have met Ben and all you guys otherwise. Justine, don't you see what's going on here? Huh? You're telling me you haven't noticed? Noticed what, Porter? What are you talking about? Who was that guy? I gestured to the vacated spot the strange man left behind. Oh, him. He's, She trailed off. She frowned into the fire. I could see her mind ticking over, and her eyes twinged with concern. I knew I wasn't going crazy. I don't know, she said. Who is it? That's what I'm trying to figure out. We stared at each other. Maybe... Justine was cut off. An ear-piercing screech came from the woods. It sounded like a shrill, injured cat. A large cat. The sound split the air and cut our conversation short. A blanket of silence fell over the four of us. Only the crackling campfire persisted. The woods was still and quiet. The hell was that? Mark broke the silence. I don't know, Sarah said. I've never quite heard an animal like that before. Sounded like some messed up mountain lion, Justine said. You ever heard anything like that before, Porter? I shook my head. My fingers tingled with adrenaline. Ben was still in the woods, and the strange man was out there with him. Dread filled my gut. There's no mountain lions out here, Mark said. It's probably an elk. They can make some creepy sounds. Sarah agreed. Justine bit a lip and scanned the woods. It's probably okay. I think Mark's right, I said to her. But I wasn't sure I believed it. Mark and Sarah had started up their conversation again when the strange man bumbled out of the woods. They paid him no mind. I was hoping something would have triggered in them by now, but they were oblivious. The strange man took a beer from the cooler. He fumbled with it, struggling with the tab. It was as if he had never opened a can before. When he finally had opened it, he sat, beer in hand, and continued to watch Mark and Sarah, a thin smile on his face. He never did take a sip. I watched him from across the campfire, his head wavering behind the heat. I touched on what made me uneasy about this strange man, aside from the fact he had managed to infiltrate our group without any of us noticing for a long time. He moved with jerkiness and awkwardness, like a newborn animal. Nothing he did was smooth or well-practiced. He made everything he did look like an act, an imitation. I didn't make the connection at the time, but I should have seen this man was not quite human. But at the moment, I wasn't sure what to think. I guess I just thought he was a freak. I considered calling him out then and there. I wanted to ask him just what the hell he was doing. But I'll admit, I was scared. I had visions of this guy being some horrific serial killer, and I didn't know how dangerous he was, or if he was armed. I didn't want to push him into doing something drastic that got us all killed. As time went by without any sign of Ben, I became convinced the strange man had done something to him. I watched him plotting, planning, and marking his next target. Anger sprouted from my fear, and I started to see red. I needed to stop him. We used an axe to chop firewood for our campfire, and it was leaning against my seat. This man was dangerous. I was sure of it. I convinced myself I needed to do something before another one of us was next. I clutched at the axe's handle. The smooth wood felt reassuring in my hand. Justine touched my arm. "Porter? Where's Ben? I'm getting nervous." "It's okay," I lied, patting her hand. "I'm sure everything is okay." I stood with axe in hand. "I'm going to get some more firewood," I announced, more awkwardly than I hoped. Okay, dude," Mark said. "Porter?" Justine's voice wavered. Speaking up was a mistake. I had drawn the attention of the strange man. I walked past him, trying to act as nonchalant as possible, but I was never a good actor. He watched me the whole way. He maintained his glare as I reached the perimeter of the woods, and as he looked back, his head rotated around an unnatural distance. That was enough to chill my spine. I was hoping he would turn around, to look away and give me an opening. But he never did. I'm not exactly sure what happened next. I never saw him stand up or walk over to me. I never even saw him move a single muscle. But in an instant, he was standing in front of me, inches away from my face. It was as if he teleported. A metallic smell stung my nose. The strange man stunk of blood and copper. The axe trembled in my hand. Any thought of actually using it fled my mind. I locked into my place, my skin covered in goosebumps. Power radiated off him. He spoke to me. "Get some firewood," he said in a forced tone, and he smiled wide. At that moment, Ben emerged from the woods. "Ben!" Justine cried. "Jesus," Ben said as Justine squeezed him. "Did you guys hear that cat thing?" "We think it was an elk," Mark said. "Where were you? Why did it take so long?" Justine asked. "I guess I wandered off too far, and I lost sight of the campfire. Took me a bit to find my way back. For a second I thought I was going to have to freeze my ass off out there alone tonight." The relief washed over my body like a wave, crashing into my muscles. I felt each one relax. At least Ben was safe. I looked for the strange man, but he was gone. He somehow slinked away while I was distracted. He was good at going undetected when he wanted to. My thoughts turned to getting out of there. Even though Ben was unharmed, that guy was still trouble. I started back towards the group and caught the middle of their conversation. "I don't know, actually. Yeah, who was that guy?" Ben said. "I thought he was with you guys," Sarah said. "Yeah, isn't he your friend?" Mark added. "I thought he drove over with you three." "No," Ben said. "I don't know who he is." The panic spread over everyone's faces. They were finally feeling what I was feeling. The realization had set in. "We need to get out of here," I said, "before he comes back." "Yes, please," Justine said. "We have to leave now. That guy was a freak, right, Porter?" "Yeah," I said. I explained to them how I noticed he was the odd man out when we were sitting around the fire. I explained the odd behavior, and they all agreed the guy was strange and possibly dangerous. None of us could pinpoint exactly when he had joined the group. He had slipped in unnoticed and unaccounted for. It was uncanny. We packed our tents in record time. We trekked the 15 minutes to our cars through the dark woods, flashlights in hand. We heard the screech of the elk again. if it was an elk, which I have doubts about now, and we took some comfort from the fact it sounded farther away. Even so, we picked up our pace for the final stretch of the walk. I felt like I could finally relax behind the wheel and lock the doors of my SUV. Justine and Ben sat in the back, while Mark and Sarah followed behind Mark's beaten-up Ford Laser. We were heading out of the woods and were planning to shack up in a motel for the night before heading home in the morning. I thought we were free and clear. We wound our way around the dark roads that snaked through woods. I let a smile open up on my face when we finally reached the exit road. It was an arrow-straight stretch of asphalt that split through the last few miles of the woodland. I pressed on the accelerator. I couldn't wait to get the hell out of there, and I think Mark was feeling the same way because he sat close on my rear bumper. I remember thinking, at least we'll have a strange tale to tell after all this. I didn't think it was about to turn into a horror story. The trees and the dashed lines on the road blurred past us. My headlights reached out for the seemingly endless road, and my speedometer needled its way towards 100 miles an hour. I don't know what possessed me to go that fast, and I wish Mark didn't follow my lead. It was a mistake. The man appeared from behind a tree. He walked into the middle of my lane. I slammed the brakes. It was too late. The next sequence of events happened so fast, it played like a slideshow in my mind. The tires screeched, and there was a smell of burning rubber. The strange man folded over my bonnet and got sent flying down the road. He skated across the pavement on his back, moving with such speed it looked as if he were gliding on ice. More tires screeching. Mark flew past us in the opposite lane, fishtailing. He fought it, and for a moment I thought he had saved it, but the car hooked right and into the trees. The sickening sound of crunching metal reverberated in the air. Mark's car slammed into a tree, driver's side first, sending fragments of glass and metal flying. The car bounded off one tree and into another. The front passenger side impacted this time. The front light exploded, and the passenger side cavity caved in, sending a wheel bounding into the woods. The crumpled heap of a car came to a rest. Justine was first out the door, crying out Sarah's name. Ben went after her, and I followed after him. Everything felt surreal as shock coursed through my body. It was as if I was watching through a screen. I floated over the asphalt as Justine and Ben sprinted towards the steaming wreckage. The crash scene dimly lit by my SUV's one remaining headlight. There are two screams I will never forget. They imprinted themselves on my brain, and I'll hear their echoes at night forever. If I happen to get Alzheimer's later in life, I know the last thing to go will be these screams. The first one I heard when I was 13. It came from my mother. It flooded the house, splashing off the walls. I ran out of my room to see her crumpled at the front door, with two police officers standing by. They had notified her that her eldest son, my brother, had died. The second came from Justine when she saw what was waiting for us in that Ford Laser. Mark was unrecognizable. He was a shattered mess of bone, skin and blood, melded and intertwined with a crumpled steel. Sarah was blinking slowly, her breathing laboured, her one arm shattered, broken in too many places to count, her legs crushed at the knees from the front of the car, which crumpled back into a leg space. Her legs would have been flat if I could see them. Justine turned away and fell to her knees, face buried in her hands, shoulders heaving. Ben tried to comfort her, but he had to turn away and throw up off the side of the road. I pulled out my phone and struggled to dial 911. With my fingers shaking, I kept pressing the wrong numbers. My voice was small and distant as I tried to explain what happened to the operator. She told me to stay in the line, but as I looked down the road, I dropped my phone. The strange man was standing there, his grin reaching from ear to ear, showing a grandstand of teeth. His shoulders shrugged up and down, as if he was laughing. In fact, that asshole was laughing. If I were not in shock, I would have gone after him right then and there. I would have torn his heart if he had one right from his chest. But all I could do was stare, mouth agape, struggling to keep the tears behind my eyes. The strange man started for the woods. I watched him go, and I watched him change. I saw it. I know I did. This was no illusion, no trick of the mind. This was real. I saw him shapeshift. I saw its true form. We were not dealing with something human that night. After countless hours of research, I believe I saw what others have called the Goatman. Its horns stuck out unevenly from its head, its grinning snout bared rows of sharp teeth, and walking upright like a man with an awkward gait, it vanished into the shrouded woods. It has been 8 months since that night. I've only seen my friends a handful of times since then. Our relationships have shattered and are left in ruin. All we are now to each other is a stark reminder of that night. Mark is dead. Sarah survived, but as a triple amputee. Justine and Ben broke up. And here I am, rugged, with a scraggly beard and uncut hair after spending every sleepless night researching the monstrosity I saw that night. The Goatman. I'm going back to those woods. So help me God, I'm going back. I'm coming for the Goatman. And I'm not stopping until one of us is dead. I've worked at this place for as long as I remember, and it's pretty weird and even harder to describe. It's your usual family fun indoor park, I guess. There's a million of them all over the place, and they all have different names. We have a crappy little cafe that overcharges for stale hot dogs, and then a buttload of warehouse space filled with random crap to keep kids entertained. There's a jungle gym, an arcade with ancient games, a greasy bowling alley, and obviously, there's a ball pit. Honestly, it's a pretty cool job, although it has taught me that kids, in general, are super weird. I remember this one time a random kid came up to me and handed me some marbles, and then just started laughing. It took me a few minutes to get it out of him, but he told me that he shoved the marbles up his butt, and now I was touching his butt marbles. And he just thought it was the funniest goddamn thing anyone has ever done. Ever. We have a high turnover rate, that's for sure. We chew through new employees like popcorn, and I think it's because kids have this weird ability to home in on anyone they make uncomfortable and just thrive off the awkwardness. At least teachers and parents get to deal with only one set of kids, right? They get to know them over time, and sure, those kids will occasionally explode or have prolonged periods of crazy high energy, but for the most part, the parents and teachers are there to manage the kids. But that's the exact opposite of what we do. We're here to manage the center, not the kids. Every kid here is meant to blow off steam. That's why parents bring them here. It's why they pay the entry fee. And we can't make these kids sit down or write lines. We can't threaten to goad or shout. What we have is a revolving door of kids who are permanently psyched out, and we're just meant to keep them occupied long enough for their parents to smoke a joint around the back or cry in the toilets where no one can see them break down. I gotta say, it's tough. I only stuck it out because I'm in management, and that means my job is to get a bunch of teenagers to do all the dirty work. It's like a pyramid scheme, but grosser. Nobody at Enron had to brush vomit out of a crying 9-year-old's hair. Still, I limit my exposure to the kids, and for a damn good reason. They scare the hell out of me. For one thing, there's always the wrong number. This place is always full, no matter how many tickets we sell. Most people don't even stay here long enough to notice. But I have. I've spent a few years now counting tickets and then heads, and I know for a fact that there are rainy days in the middle of the coldest winters when we sell 10, maybe 20 tickets at most. But no matter what, the floor is crawling with kids. Another thing, kids go to the ball pit and don't come out. Nobody complains, nobody's reported missing. But I know for a fact that not only do some kids never come back out, but some kids that do come out never went in the first place. I already know what you're thinking, that I'm nuts. But I once trialed a photo day just to confirm my suspicions. I took pics of the kids and parents coming and going. I said it was for a competition. And I swear to God, I have dozens of photos of parents coming in with one kid and leaving with a totally different one. I've thought about trying to empty the ball pit out to see if there's anywhere they could go, like a tunnel I never knew about. I did try to empty it once. It was years ago, and I wanted to clean it properly, so I waited until after hours and started scooping balls out and dumping them into empty bins. But after a while, I got scared and stopped. Something about the experience just freaked me out. It was like the more balls I pulled out, the quieter everything got. Like the whole place started to anticipate something. All those weird cartoon characters painted onto the walls with freaky eyes that follow you around the room. The zombie shooter arcade machines that make those stupid, fake ghoul noises. The twisty airplane rocket that rocks back and forth and blasting obnoxious music. It all kind of faded out. It was like the whole place held its breath, and my head started to throb like the world's worst hangover, and my mouth started tasting all coppery, and it made me want to retch. It freaked me out, and I stopped and just tipped the balls back in. As soon as I did, the pressure in my head released, and the place was full of noise again, like nothing had even changed. Now, I just clean the ball pit out with one of those nets they use for swimming pools. There's always the weirdest stuff in there. Dead mice, crushed insects, dog poo, random goo, and what I can only describe as a series of gifts or messed up experiments. I don't know where they come from, but a week hasn't gone past where I haven't had to fish some half-dead, tortured animal out of the depths of that pit. If I'm lucky, The animal dies as soon as I pull it out, but I keep a spare pillowcase around here, just in case. I don't know how humane it is to be stuffed into a sack and smashed against an alley wall, but I know it has to be more humane than keeping them alive. I used to think the kids dragged roadkill in there, but after I started paying a little more attention, I noticed things like badly sutured wounds stitched together with random threads, or even half-healed amputations. I don't think it's even possible for a kid to pull off such a successful trepanning on a squirrel and keep the thing alive, half paralyzed at the bottom of a ball pit. It just doesn't make sense. But I keep finding them, half stuffed with bugs, eyelids cut off. Jesus Christ, the worst one didn't even have any cuts. I still don't know who did it or how. I don't know how the ball got inside the rat. It was alive, with no scars or open wounds, but it was like it had swallowed the whole damn ball. It wasn't crying or making any noise. It was just shivering, alive and in shock at what had happened to it. The pain must have been overwhelming. All of its organs crushed, its bones pushed out of sockets. Just looking at it made me want to hurl. It was the most unnatural thing I've ever seen. It's just another reason why I couldn't ask anyone else to do this job. I think most people come and go so quickly, they never realize just how weird it is. I'd rather no one start asking questions. I think if I was braver, I'd try to dig a little deeper, and I'd encourage others to help me. But no one else has seen the weirdness up close like I have, and I guess my conclusion is this. If we don't know what's down there, why bother it? It's clearly best to just leave it alone. That's why I'm glad we have a high turnover rate. People get super weird if they stick around too long. I've moved a few people on because they started to go a bit loopy. First, we see paranoia setting in. They start looking at you funny. Or the kids. I mean, the kids I get. But me? What's wrong with me? Second, we see them starting to fixate on the ball pit. People who stay too long obsess over it. When you're not looking, they'll sneak over and try to jam a broomstick into the bottom. When they can't find it, they'll start freaking out, talking about foundations and floor plans. Finally, the worst ones will start trying to go over my head and speak to corporate. They go nuts, asking questions and ringing numbers and just bugging me over and over. If you're not careful, they can actually become quite threatening. I know you wouldn't think it, but people get really wound up about this kind of stuff. One girl I had to call the cops on. She developed a real unhealthy interest in me. She even asked me where I lived. She wanted to know where I slept and ate and who my parents were. Even after I fired her, she kept coming back, even tried to burn the place down. I think this place messes with people's minds because she started talking about how the number to HQ just went to my office. My driver's license was fake, my clothes had someone else's name sewed onto them. Where did I even go at night? Where did I sleep? Where was my car? She even revealed that one night she'd camped outside the building and waited for me like some goddamn stalker. When I confronted her about it, she had no defense. She was completely gone over the edge, talking about how the old manager went missing years ago and I was wearing his uniform and no one had ever seen me outside the center. I'm glad she's gone now, because she made me really uncomfortable with that paranoid rambling. I still don't know what she was implying. Honestly, just listening to her gave me a really bad headache with a coppery taste. I still wonder what happened to her. But she's a good example of why we should just leave this thing alone, because, sure enough, the next week, I found myself fishing one of her shoes out of the ball pit. I think what was weirdest about that was that it wasn't covered in blood or anything like that. It just had a small note asking me, personally, for help. She was so troubled. I tried to tell her to stop, tried to give her some clue. When I'd fired her, just before the stalking started, she started asking me all these questions about how long I'd been working here and whether I'd seen the bottom of the ball pit. And I kept trying to tell her, I've been here for as long as I can remember, and I'm pretty sure the ball pit is bottomless. Well, now she can be sure about it too. I'd never heard of the brand before, but it was cheap and I needed one. I assumed they were all made in the same Chinese factory anyway. It was shrink wrapped to protect the screen and had no manual, but something about it appealed to me. It seemed different somehow. I told the staff I wanted it. They put it on a rolling cart and carried it out to my car. Unfortunately, I didn't notice the strange inputs on the back until I got home. Then I understood why it was so cheap compared to the others they had with the same screen size. It was probably a store return from someone who didn't know what to do with it. I figured the odd ports were for a newer technology I wasn't familiar with. Instead of returning it like the previous owner had, I made a mental note to take a photo of the back panel. If I could find the correct adapters to hook it up to my older AV system, I'd be way ahead of the tech curve. That was always the problem with new electronics. They changed connectors. To my amazement, there was programming on the screen, even though I hadn't set the Wi-Fi up yet. I wasn't sure if I was pulling in local on-air free broadcasts or if it had somehow set itself up automatically. If so, that was a bit alarming. I hadn't entered my password or login credentials. I just pressed the power button and it was instantly up and running. Doing the setup is always a pain on new devices, so it was an unexpected perk to avoid the headache. But I was still freaked out that it could do all that without my help. Did the new TV communicate with my modem and router to bypass the security protocols? If so, how did my internet equipment know the monitor was okay to communicate with? My head swam with crazy theories. Perhaps it was so advanced that all of my devices were already in full communication when I carried it into the house. If my internet firewall recognized the phone in my pocket as me, it might have sensed it was okay to trust the new device since I brought it in. Amazing. I didn't have much time to dwell on it though. The programming on every channel was beyond strange. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. It certainly wasn't local public broadcasts. That much was for certain. While flipping through the myriad of choices, I failed to find anything even remotely familiar or recognizable. I stopped trying to explain where the bizarre content came from anymore. That was irrelevant. The disturbing visuals on the screen continued to come, and they filled me with a deepening sense of dread which I couldn't shake. It was as hypnotizing as it was mortifying. For lack of a better term, I was glued to a consuming parade of personal train wrecks and humanitarian catastrophes. The footage on every channel was like the faces of death, non-stop reality programming. The gritty visuals were painful to watch, yet I couldn't force myself to avert my eyes. Even when I mustered the strength to turn the channel, it was just more of the same grisly violence and carnal gore. War, suicides, automobile accidents, natural disasters, wild animal attacks, executions. It was all there to witness in vivid, blood-red colour. It was an ugly collection of concentrated pain. There weren't any commercials or station breaks. There were no network watermarks on the side of the screen either. It was awkward and surreal. Channel after channel of inhumane atrocities flashed in front of my unblinking eyes and leached into my brain like a deadly drug. It was a constant stream of raw negativity that I wanted to recoil in horror from, but couldn't. Somehow, I managed to look down at my watch and did a double take. At first, I assumed it was broken, but I looked past the flickering carnage and saw the unmistakable darkness outside my window. 6 hours of my life had simply evaporated. I'd been entranced by bloody mayhem and unapologetic violence to the exclusion of all else, shown in every shade of the rainbow. The shock of lost time was enough to temporarily break the hold it had on me. I reached for the remote to shut it off. I had to act fast before I was reluctantly drawn back into the addictive oblivion of the mystery footage. I pressed the power button. Nothing. The visceral bloodletting continued on, unabated. I set the remote down. They always provide those cheap, no-name batteries that are almost dead when you get them. I had to turn the TV off, manually. Another 4 hours transpired in zombified trance. My eyes watered, and my throat grew parched. I'd witnessed more evil and unnatural death that a person should see in 20 jaded lifetimes. I leaned forward and pressed the physical button on the front bezel. It, too, failed to shut off the unit. Part of me didn't care at all. I didn't mind if I never ate again, or if I watched it all day and lost my job. I was transfixed on the eternal glow of the 50-inch screen in front of me, with an unknown broadcast source. With the remote and manual button not working, I struggled to get up and unplug it from the wall. It wasn't easy to tear myself away from it, but I felt as if the constant stream of dark atrocities was physically draining me of life. To my dismay, the plug wouldn't come out of the socket. A closer inspection of the receptacle and power cord revealed they had melted into an organic-looking solid connection. Stranger than that, all of my HDMI and AV cables were also joined with the unknown ports at the back of the unit. It was like vines genetically spliced to their mates. I couldn't begin to explain the unnatural technology fusion that had occurred, but my new flat panel didn't want to be disconnected. That much was obvious. It was some kind of life form, and it was feeding off my bewitched attention. Like a hard slap on the face, realizing the depth of what was going on served as a much-needed, sobering influence. It did no good to tug on the cords. They were permanently fused together. Knowing that all living creatures have defense mechanisms in place to protect them from harm, I didn't waste time trying to sever the cords or cables with a knife or scissors. That would probably result in some serious retaliation on its part. I had no idea what it could or couldn't do, but I wasn't taking any unnecessary chances. it had already managed to hypnotize me for 12 hours straight while I neither ate, drank, or slept. It had a deeply powerful sense of attraction. I went to do an internet search about it. I figured there would be others who experienced this dark phenomenon. That's when I noticed my laptop looked very strange. There was something odd about it which I couldn't place. It looked shinier than before. As a matter of fact, it looked newer than new. It positively glowed on my desk. I went to wake it up, but stopped myself at the last second. Instead, I crouched down and looked behind the desk at the outlet it was plugged into. I couldn't believe it. The damn thing was fused to the wall receptacle, just like the new flat panel downstairs. Somehow, it had infected my computer too. I raced upstairs to inspect the bedroom TV. It was permanently fused together, and the screen displayed the same cavalcade of depressing carnage. All throughout my house, every piece of electronics and appliances I owned was physically joined to a power source. Even the toaster was connected. I had an old tube TV in the basement. It still worked, but it was so outdated that I just stored it on a pile of unusual things until I could haul it to the dump. I was curious to see if it was untouched. On the wall, there was a foreign electrical tether extended from a nearby outlet and stretched across the floor like an ambitious vine. It slowly snaked its way toward the old TV to complete the circuit. As soon as the umbilicus could reach the power cord, it would be fused too. To say I was in a crisis would be an understatement. Some creepy alien entity was slowly taking over my home. I'd brought it inside, just like an electronic Trojan horse. The unit at the salvage store was basically just a disguised seed. Like a fool, I carried it home and planted it. I wanted to call the store to warn them or summon the police to witness the creepy invasion I had triggered, but even my home phone was fused to the jack. My cell was almost dead too, but I couldn't very well plug it up to recharge it. I tossed it down in disgust and grabbed my car keys. I had to get out of the house before the TV, stereo, or my computer lured me back to the zombified trance I'd narrowly detached from. Predictably, my escape was interrupted. In the hallway by my front door was the main household fuse panel. Its door was wide open. Sticking out of it was a large 220-volt electrical line that certainly didn't exist before. I tried to imagine what the electrical entity was trying to merge with now. The dryer was in another part of the house, and I couldn't think of anything else that used a power line that thick. Then, the chilling reality dawned on me. This unnatural tether was intended to fuse with me. I backed up slowly and sought another escape route out of the house. In desperation, I ended up climbing out of a window. At that point, I was running on pure instinct. I didn't even think of all the electrical lines in my car. I just got in and turned the key. My doors locked on me, and the radio started blaring. It started playing the most caustic, malevolent music I'd ever heard. I tried to open the door, but the handle wouldn't work, and my seatbelt had me fully restrained. My mind fought, but the music started drawing me in. The vicious pattern of the rhythms and the blast beats started to be more appealing. With each passing moment, I resisted less, I was starting to enjoy the sonic brutality. Just like the deadly influx of carbon monoxide into the bloodstream, I was rapidly being taken over by the influence of it. Every passing moment made it exponentially harder to fight. In a final act of resistance, I shouted above the din of the death metal and reached for my pocket knife. I sliced the seatbelt strap and managed to get out of it. The heat came on inside the car. It was already a hot summer day, and with the windows rolled up, the inside temperature was well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Sweat boiled out of my pores and down my face. The unknown electrical-based organism was punishing me for resisting it. The window switch wouldn't work either, but I had another emergency solution. I jammed my knife savagely into the canvas of the convertible top and sliced hard. I managed to escape my would-be tomb via internal cesarean section. I don't know how far the infection has spread beyond my house, but I've managed to find an uninfected computer in an internet cafe downtown. I must hurry and detail the horrors of this bizarre epidemic and warn the unsuspecting public before it's too late for all of us. I believe this horrific thing can be defeated, but the easiest way is just to avoid the infection in the first place. Be careful what you buy and plug into your home. Time is of the essence. I'm asking for some brave volunteers to go back with me to my home and torch the place before it spreads to an area that can't easily be contained. So, who's with me in this deadly mission? I have a very logical view of things. I believe in evolution and the natural order. After my experience with the unknown species hiding under our noses, I still think that way, but I'm a little more open to the existence of things we could be overlooking. Higher ranks on the food chain that we are blissfully unaware of. There is still much of our world left unexplored, and even if we did trample through our entire globe searching, I believe there would still be creatures that exist completely undisturbed and undiscovered by us. At its core, evolution is pretty straightforward. The most desirable traits are based on how well they help you thrive. They are passed on because what makes you strong and unique increases your chance of survival and the survival of your offspring. If you try to think of giants existing in the world, you can't conceive it. Because if they are bumbling, heavy and slow, it would make it too easy for us. With our advantage in speed and firepower, we'd probably control them or kill them off if we thought they would endanger our chances of survival. If they did exist, they'd have to hold the opposite traits. Lithe, fast, and lightweight so we couldn't hear them coming. Camouflaged so we couldn't notice them passing by. Hidden so well they could never be found. It sounds like an impossible task, but with enough time and careful selection, anything is possible. I believe that wholeheartedly now. I have reevaluated what I associate with giants and how I perceive the world. I've never really been superstitious, and up to this point, I never really believed in ghosts, fairies, demons, vampires, or anything like that. But I can see them now. I know where the true giants are, and with that knowledge, I know that there must be other things smart enough to avoid us, intelligent enough to realize that making their presence known would only speak their doom. They use what they have to simply avoid conflict, live in peace, hunt in the deepest and darkest parts of the world, or live amongst us undetected. Those are the ones we fantasize about, tell stories of in the eerie glow of fire, flickering off of fearful, wide eyes. I grew up in an area where the night skies were bright with thousands of stars, and the grounds wore the heaviest of shadows. In child eyes, I've seen a giant panther the size of a mansion weave blindly through the trees, so careful not a single strand of hair touched the branch, so unfathomably light-footed that not one leaf shifted under its body. It kept its eyes shut that night, but on another occasion, it faced my house, and I saw it through my bedroom window. I thought it was the moon, but I knew the moon had risen and passed over the house hours ago. The panther only had one eye open. It was strange, bleached and speckled with dark spots like the surface of a giant rock that sat in our sky. White flecks glowed across its face like stars. I have realized with age that sometimes we think so small. We see a stick bug and think something so huge couldn't possibly mimic our environment without our notice like the small ones can. But in the right circumstances, why couldn't they? It was many years before I saw another. I lived in a rather peaceful town now, a place I knew I would have a difficult time finding a giant. So I went places I thought no one else would. I believed many of them hid in the cloak of darkness, so I took many walks at night, staring at the moon and wondering what else could possibly be out there. Unfortunately, my second encounter was not so peaceful. Rarely did people show up to some of the deserted places I visited, but if they did, they often had different intentions than I did. I stood in the middle of a pathway near the lake, mostly uninjured, my wallet emptied, and a group wandering away from me with grins plastered on their faces and an extra couple $100 to split among them. I rested against the tree, trying to regain my bearings, when I heard the barest of cracks echoing along the shoreline of the pond. I looked towards the mob that had taken my wallet. One of them had strayed behind the others. He was walking towards a strange formation of rocks, counting bills. I swore the focal point, a massive rock, had been settled on the ground before, when I passed it not long ago. It now sat up at an impossible angle. It was the size of a small speedboat, in the vague shape of a jaw, the tip curving down, almost like the wide open beak of a snapping turtle. The others had walked past it, but in his distraction, he walked under it. There was barely any sound, but I witnessed the formation shift in the blink of an eye. The thump was so dull and quiet, I still feel as if I imagined it. The men continued walking, entirely unaware one of their members was now missing. I didn't want them to realize his disappearance before I left the area. I contracted a new fear that night as I ran as quietly as possible out of the park and back home, my eyes wide and flickering across my surroundings the entire journey. I did not walk at night after that. The desire to seek the giants out dwindled along with that hobby. I knew then that I'd been lucky to survive 2 encounters thus far, so I wasn't looking for the third, especially not in broad daylight, when I discovered it. I was reading a book under a massive old tree that stood tall and towering in the middle of campus. It was a feature of the university, located smack in the middle of the new city I called home. It's odd when you suddenly become conscious of your breathing. It happens to all sorts of people. the sudden realization and awareness of something your body does automatically. It's awkward to transition back to ignoring it. I never thought that the awareness might have been a response to your own body being thrown off course, your mind losing its tempo in the presence of another beat. I took my eyes off my book and glanced down at my chest, rising and falling. I subtly held my breath to try and reset the mindless action. My chest continued to move, and a part of my brain connected dots I hadn't paid any mind to in years. I closed my eyes, leaned back against the tree, and ceased breathing again. I felt it. The sudden movement that was not my own. The large oak was breathing in tandem with me. Or it was trying to. In the light of day, I was not as afraid. But I also did not push my luck. I resumed my regular breathing, as well as my book. The branches and leaves rustled in the breeze, and I thought of the silence of the panther and the stillness of the turtle. And I knew now that some did not need to be so still. A tree too still would stand out among the others that followed the patterns of the wind. I tried to see the world through larger eyes, but I still was only able to see a few more giants throughout my lifetime. I've never thought to mention the giants to others until now. I'm getting older, and I want to let people see more of the wonders our world holds. The only difference it will make you is you may be able to open your eyes a little wider and witness something others only dream of. Be warned, you must not seek them out. They live their lives and we live ours. If you meet your death by the hands of one of them, it would simply be the natural order of things, the circle of life and death. I would say that we outnumber them, but I do not know if we do. They do not mean us harm, so you must leave them be. Unless you're really looking, you'll never see them anyway. But let it be known that we are not at the top of the food chain. Not by a long shot.